Chapter 26 of The Ghost Ship. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Ghost Ship by John Conran Hutcheson. Chapter 26, We Part Company. While Garry O'Neil and I were attending to the two French sailors who, though they had been a good bit knocked about in the course of the protracted struggle, were not seemingly very seriously hurt, suffering more, indeed, from want of proper food and rest than from the slight wounds they had received, we heard loud cries and a sort of dull moaning that appeared to proceed from the after part of the saloon. Going thither at once, Captain Applegarth knocked with his knuckles on the panel of the closed door of one of the larger staterooms, running athwart the ship, from whence the sounds proceeded. "Hullo, within there!" he shouted. "What's the matter? What's the row? Come out!" A shrill scream was the only response to his inquiries. "What's the matter?" repeated the skipper, speaking in a gentler tone. "You have nothing to fear. We're all friends here." Cries and confused noises continued, however, and the skipper thereupon resumed his knocking, this time more forcibly, and with his fists aided by a kick from his heavy boot against the lower part of the still closed door. At this imperative summons the shrieking ceased, and we heard a feeble voice within calling out, in French, "Mercy, for the love of God!" We could distinguish amidst a plenitude of sobs and violent groans in a deeper key. "Oh, brave Haytians, have pity and spare our lives!" "Hang it all, you cowards, we're not those cursed Haytians, and I wish you could have been left to their mercy. It is only what you deserve!" roared the skipper, infuriated and out of all patience at the Frenchwoman's mistake and her appealing in such terms to the murderous scoundrels of whom we had made so summary an end. "We're Englishmen, and we're your friends. I tell you, true-hearted British sailors, who have come to rescue you, so open the door!" But Madame Boisson, who of course was his interlocutress behind the door, remained obdurate. "Oh, the false English!" she cried. "Down with the pigs!" At this the skipper laughed grimly, and all standing near him were much amused. "She's a good specimen of her race," cried the captain. "They always abuse other nations and cry out that they are being betrayed when ill luck comes to them, instead of trying to help themselves, as we perfidious Englishmen do." Finding it impossible to persuade her, though, to open the door of the cabin, which was bolted and barred within, the skipper sang out to me to go on deck and ask Elsie Vereker to come down and try what she could do, thinking that the obstinate prisoner would doubtless recognize the girl's voice, and so, through her means, be made more amenable to reason. No sooner said than done. Up I went and down the companionway. I returned anon, accompanied not only by Miss Elsie, but by the colonel as well, Garry O'Neil, who hurried up the ladder after me with that intent, insisting on his coming below so that he could the better attend to his wounded leg, which had broken out again and needed fresh dressing, and after some difficulty Garry got him down in safety. Thanks to Elsie's pleadings, Madame Boisson at length capitulated, promising to come out of her retreat as soon as she had had time to make her toilette. "By George!" exclaimed the skipper, overhearing this, and turning with an ironical grin to the colonel, who had his leg upon a chair, and Garry bustling about him, busy with bandages. "She's a true Frenchwoman, as I said at first. Fancy after being imprisoned there in that stuffy cabin for 24 hours, and imagining herself and husband might be murdered every minute by a lot of pirate scoundrels, thinking of nothing but tictifying herself, instead of thanking God for their escape and rushing out at the very first opportunity, eager to be free. Strange creatures!" "Heavens!" exclaimed the colonel, smiling at the other's outburst. "It is true, but they're all alike. And I've seen a good many of them, my friend." Presently out sailed Madame Boisson, who I noticed was a middle-aged and well-preserved woman, attired in an elaborate dressing gown with a profusion of bows and ribbons fluttering about it, and with a good deal of pearl powder or some other cosmetic of that sort on her face, and her cheeks tinted here and there with, colour. Despite her screams and hysterics, however, there was no trace of a tear in her twinkling black eye, although her fat little husband, who ambled meekly in her train, betrayed signs of great emotion, his red face all swollen from crying, and otherwise looking like a whipped cur. Madame made a most gracious salute to us all, and glancing at me with a spice of coquetry, to which she was evidently not unaccustomed, was pleased to observe that I was un beau garçon. In returning the skipper's polite bow, she happened to notice the poor wounded sailors lying on the cushions by the companion, and the blood all sprinkled about, a sight at which she turned up her nose, declaring very volubly that the place was like a pigsty, unfit for any lady to enter, and expressing her surprise at those common seamen being attended to and allowed to remain in the saloon, she having always understood that that apartment was only for the use of the first-class passengers. The skipper, who understood her well enough, as I did too, having learnt the language at a French school near Rouen, was very angry at her remarks. "Those men," said he in his best Parisian, "are your own countrymen. All that are left of those who died to preserve the lives of you and your husband here, who ought to be ashamed of himself for skulking below whilst they were fighting on deck." Monsieur looked foolish, but said nothing in reply to this. Madame sniffed, and flashed her glittering black eyes, as if she could annihilate him at a glance. "My brave Hercules!" she cried indignantly. "Be easy! You have been out in the Bois and have established your reputation as a hero, and have no need to notice the insulting remarks of this Englishman. But for you," she added, turning angrily to the colonel, "this would not have happened." "I? Good heavens!" exclaimed Colonel Vereker, greatly astonished at her turning on him thus. "Why, it was I who did all in my power to prevent Captain Alphonse from allowing those cursed blacks on board the ship in the first instance. But you and Monsieur Boisson, both of you, persuaded him to the contrary." "My God, dear Hercules, see how we are calumniated," said the irate Frenchwoman rather illogically, turning to her miserable atom of a husband, who gesticulated and shrugged his shoulders in response, and looking over the skipper and Colonel Vereker as if neither existed, she went on to remark to Elsie, who, however, did not appear to relish very much her conversation or endearments, that some persons, whom she would not condescend to name, were of monsters the most infamous and ungrateful, men indeed of the gutter, but that she, the little one, was an angel." Here the skipper put an end to the interview. He had evidently seen and had enough of the Boissons, husband and wife, and ascending the companion ladder at the same time as Garry and myself, I heard him muttering to himself as he went along, and just caught the following words: "To think brave men lose valuable, have such, there's too dreadful. Gee, frivolous, she a damned coward," laying a rather strong emphasis on the last words. We afterwards went down again, Garry and I, and managed between us to bring up little Mr. Johnson, the brave fellow having picked up wonderfully, after the attention we had given him, and the knife thrust he had received from the negro was found to have only grazed his ribs, and he was anxious for fresh air, after his long imprisonment below, and to see and judge for himself how things were looking on deck after our scrimmage. Here the light was waning, and there was a good deal to be done. "I think, Fawcett," said the skipper to our worthy first mate, who had been ordering matters forward while the former had come aft, "we had better muster the hands first, so as to know who's missing. I'm afraid several of our poor fellows have lost a number of their mess in the fight." "Aye, sir, they have," replied Mr. Fawcett. "Poor Stoddart's gone for one." Poor fellow, I am sorry," exclaimed the captain with much feeling. "We couldn't have lost a better man, for he was about the best we had on board, poor fellow. A good engineer, a good messmate, and good at everything he handled, besides being the finest fellow that ever wore shoe leather. How did it happen?" "He was knifed by one of those black devils, sir, as he led the boarders forward." "Poor Stoddart, I am sorry to lose you. Well, there's no use crying over spilt milk, and all my words will never bring him back again. Mr O'Neill, just muster the men in the waist and let us know the worst at once."
"Faith, you're right, sir. We'd better count noses and have the job over,"
returned Garry, sotto voce, singing out in a louder key to the survivors of the fray, who were grouped in the waist about the mainmast, where the remaining Haytians, who had not been killed outright, were tied up, feet to the wrists, as the skipper had told Colonel Vereker when he came up.
"Now, all you Star of the North that are still alive, come over here to starboard. The chaps that are dead, sure, can stop where they are."
The hands laughed at this Hibernian way of putting the matter to them, and answered their names readily, on Garry proceeding to read out the muster roll from a paper he had drawn out of his pocket. All, that is, save those that had fallen, 8 in number, including poor Stoddart, our energetic second engineer, and one of his firemen, who had volunteered to swell the boarding party, as well as 6 of our best sailors amongst the foremast hands. Of the rest of the crew, 4 were badly hurt and a few slightly wounded. Spokeshave was one of these latter, having unfortunately the end of his nose, that prominent feature of his, cut clean off by a slash from a cutlass, but the majority, we were glad to find, mostly escaped unscathed. Seeing old Masters all right, I thought of his morbid forebodings before we came up with the ship, and determined to take a rise out of him. "I'm awfully sorry about the old boatswain," I said, with a wink to Garry right behind his back. "He wasn't a bad seaman, but an awful old grumbler, and so superstitious that he funked his own shadow and daren't walk up a hatchway in the dark. Poor old chap, though, it's a pity he's dead. I shall miss him, if only from not hearing his continued growling over things that might happen." "Well, I'm blessed!" cried old Masters, completely flabbergasted at this exordium of mine. "I never thought, Master Haldane, to hear you speak agin me like that. I always believed you was my friend, that I did." I pretended not to see him, and so too did Garry O'Neill, tumbling to my game, as the saying goes, while I went on with my chaff. "How did he die?" I asked. "Was he killed at the first rush?"
"Faith, I can't say correctly,"
replied Garry in a very melancholy tone of voice.
"I'm afeard care carried him off, somehow or other, as it killed the cat. For he was the most disconsolate, doleful, downhearted chap I ever seen piping the hands to dinner. And so he's dead. Poor old boatswain. We'll never see his like again."
"Lord bless you!" cried old Masters angrily, stepping up nearer and confronting us. "I'm not dead at all. I tell you, I'm blessed if I am. Can't you see me here alive and hearty before you look at me?"
"Oh, it's his ghost!" I said with an affected and tremulous start. "He told me, poor fellow, he felt himself doomed and nothing could save him, and I suppose his spirit wants to prove to me he wasn't a liar, as I always thought he was, the old sinner." This was too much for Garry, and he couldn't hold in any longer, and both of us roared at Masters, who looked scared, and though angry and highly incensed with us at first, was only too glad at its being but a joke, and not a fact that he was dead, to bear us any ill feeling long. We were horrified when we were told later on, while we were committing to the deep the corpses of those slain, negroes and white men impartially sharing the same grave beneath the placid sea, at rest like themselves, the breeze having died away again soon after sunset, that Etienne Brago and Francois Tern, the two wounded sailors we had left below with the Boissons, and little Mr Johnson, and the colonel, and Elsie, of course, that these were the only ones left of the 30-odd souls on board the Saint Pierre when she sailed from La Guayra a fortnight before. After all the bodies had been buried in their watery tomb, not forgetting that of poor Ivan, who we all thought merited an honoured place by the side of his biped brethren of valour. Well, after all this had been done, the skipper had the pumps rigged and the decks sluiced down to wash away all traces of the fray. A council of war was then held between us all on the poop, the skipper of course presiding, and the colonel coming up from the cabin to take part in the proceedings, as well as old Mr Stokes from our ship, where he had remained attending single-handed to the duties of the engine-room, denying himself, as Garry O'Neil remarked, the fun of the fighting." This conclave had been called for the purpose of deciding what was to be done with the Saint Pierre and the captured black pirates, from whom we had salvaged her, and without much deliberation it was pretty soon decided, on the colonel's suggestion, to send the ship to her destined port, Liverpool, taking the negroes in her, so that they could be tried before a proper court in England for the offence they had committed.
"It's of no use your fetching them up to New York," said the colonel, "for though I'm an American myself and am proud of my nationality, I must confess those Yanks of the North mix up dollars and justice in a way that puzzles folks that are not accustomed to their way of holding the scales."
The skipper was of the same opinion as Colonel Vereker, so, the matter having been settled, a navigating party was selected to work the Saint Pierre across the Atlantic, with Garry O'Neil as chief officer. The skipper was unable to spare Mr Fawcett, and Garry was all the more fit in every way for the part, as he would be able to look after the wounded French sailors, who would naturally go in the ship, as they were the principal witnesses against the blacks on the charges that would be brought against them of piracy on the high seas. It was dark when all these details were finally arranged, and all of them went back aboard on our vessel for rest and refreshment, the colonel and his daughter, of course, accompanying us. Madame and Monsieur Boisson, however, could not be made to leave the ship, saying they would not do so. Madame, that is, said it, and the brave Hercule, following her lead as usual, would not leave, said she repeatedly, until they once more touched terra firma. And not wishing they should be starved for their obstinacy, the skipper ordered Weston to look after the happy pair and provide them with food at the same time as he did the wounded and prisoners. The two vessels remained for the night, still lashed alongside for better security, all hands being too tired out, besides, to be able to do anything further beyond turning in and getting as much rest and sleep as they could after the fatigue and excitement of the day. Next morning at sunrise, Garry O'Neil went back to his ship with his crew of 8 men, all the skipper was able to spare him, and by breakfast time they had made her all a taut, bending new sails, which they found below in the forepeak, in place of the tattered rags that hung from some of the yards, and otherwise making good defects, preparing the vessel for her passage home. We were all sorry to part with Garry, even for the short period that would elapse before he would rejoin the old barkie, for he was the life of all of us aboard. But the same regret was not felt for Master Spokeshave, when we saw him go over the side to accompany the Irishman, the skipper having so decreed, as his assistant navigator, the damage to his nose not necessarily affecting his taking the sun, though it might interfere with the little beggar's altitudes of another character. By 8 bells, all the details necessary under the circumstances were satisfactorily arranged, including the transfer of the effects belonging to the colonel and Miss Elsie, those two preferring the voyage with us, unlike their whilom passengers, the Boissons, who remained in their old quarters, going with Captain Garry, as we all dubbed our messmate on his promotion to a separate command, and half an hour or so later, a splendid breeze just then springing up from the westwards and flecking the still blue water with buoyant life, the two ships parted company amid a round of enthusiastic cheers that only grew faint as the distance widened them apart,
the Saint Pierre sailing off right before the wind, with everything set below and aloft, across the ocean on her course for St. George's Channel, while we braced our yards sharp up and bore away full speed ahead in the opposite direction, bound for New York, which port we safely reached without further mishap 4 days later. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Ghost Ship. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Ghost Ship by John Conrad Hutcheson. Chapter 27. I Go to Venezuela. "You'd better stick to us," said the skipper to Colonel Vereker, who talked of taking the next Cunard steamer, which was advertised to leave on the morrow, as the Star of the North was being berthed in our company's dock on the East River. "I'm only going to stop here long enough to discharge our cargo and ship a fresh one, which is all ready and waiting for us, and then, sir, we'll make tracks, as our friends the Yankees say, right away over the herring pond to Liverpool as fast as steam and sail can carry the old barkie. Better stick to us, Colonel, and see the voyage out." "All right, Senor Applegarth," replied the Colonel, who could not drop his Spanish phraseology all at once, though otherwise gradually returning to his and our native tongue, and becoming less of a foreigner in every way. "I will return with you." Both were as good as their word, he and little Elsie coming home with us, and the skipper making the passage from Sandy Hook to the Mersey in 8 days from land to land, the fastest run we had ever achieved across the Atlantic, whether outward or homeward bound. But, quick as we were, the Saint Pierre managed to reach Liverpool before we did, the pilot who boarded us off the Skerries bringing the news that she had gone up the river a tide ahead of us. This piece of intelligence was confirmed beyond question by Garry O'Neil coming off in the company's tug that sheered alongside as we dropped anchor in the stream later on, midway between the Prince's landing stage and the Birkenhead shore, the manager of our line being anxious to compliment the skipper on his successful rescue of the French ship, the percentage on whose valuable cargo for bringing her safely to port, and thus saving all loss to the underwriters, would more than repay any damage done for the detention of our vessel when engaged on the errand of mercy and justice that took her off her course. In addition, likewise to the thanks of the company and the underwriters, the skipper was also presented with a handsome gold chronometer watch by the Committee of Lloyd's, besides participating in the amount awarded by the charterers of the Saint Pierre for the salvage of the ship, though in the latter apportionment it was only fair to mention that we all shared, officers and crew alike, I for my part coming into the sudden possession of such a tidy little sum of ready money that I felt myself a comparative millionaire. When talking with Garry, whom it is almost needless to say all hands were glad to see again, the men cheering him lustily as he crossed the gangway from the tug, he told us that though otherwise they had had a fairly pleasant voyage after parting company with us off the Azores, the boisson gave him a good deal of trouble. Madame, he said, worried his life out by making eyes at him when he went below at meal times, while on deck he was never safe for a moment from her embarrassing attentions, unless in desperation, as he was often forced to do, he went aloft to get out of her way. "Faith, and sure that weren't the worst of it neither," complained Garry in his humorous way. "Though the vain, silly old creature bate Banagher for flirting, and indeed bates every other of her sex. God bless 'em, that I've ever clapped eyes on yet. That queer little Frenchy chap, her husband, the little sparrow, must needs get jealous, and makes out it's all my fault, and belave me, a nice time I had of it altogether. At last I said to him, after having been more than usual exasperated by him, if you want to fight me, begorra, you can begin as soon as you like, at the same time showing him me fists. Ah, non, mon Dieu, non, not yet, they, says he, jumping away from me when he caught sight of me fists. I was mean the duel and the rapier. Not me, faith, says I. If it's duelling you want, you'll have to go to another shop, Monsieur Parlez-vous, for it ain't in my line. Allow me to tell you, too, Monsieur Bosun, that if you dare to hint at such a thing against while I'm in command of this ship, the only satisfaction you'll ever have out of me, in the rapier way, will be a rap on the head with this stick of mine here, you recollect, just to try the strength of your cranium, begorra. Faith, that settled the matter. The little beggar turning as pale as a codfish, and going below at once, looking very dejected and crestfallen. He never said another word after that to me as long as he remained aboard, nor did Madame trouble me very much with her attentions. On the contrary, bedad, from the day this happening till yesterday, where she were set ashore at the landing stage yonder, she looked mighty sour at me if we chanced to mate on deck. Ay, faith, as sour as a babby that's been weaned on buttermilk. Why, inquired the skipper, when we had both a good laugh at Garry and his account of the Boisson episode, have they left then, the ship for good? Faith, yes, sir, bag and baggage, the blessed pair of 'em, and mighty pleased I were to see the backs of 'em. But how about the trial of those black devils, those pirates, and won't they be required as witnesses against the murderers? No, sir, replied Garry. The police officer that came aboard when we got into dock said they didn't want Monsieur nor Madame either, as they didn't know a ha'porth of the jambole, worse luck, they being below all the time. The magistrates think the two French sailors were going on fine by the same token, and the colonel, all of whom were on deck and saw everything that went on, would be sufficient witnesses again the Haytian scoundrels. Oh, said the skipper, have these men been brought up before the magistrates? Aye, yesterday afternoon, sir, and they've been remanded, whatever that may mean. That ought to have been reprimanded, I'm thinking, and a cat o' nine tails if they had their deserts, till next Tuesday. The magistrates belaying the old Star of the North with you, Captain, with the colonel aboard, to give evidence against the mutineers that they wouldn't be in from New York afore then, not knowing what the old barkie could do in the way of steaming as you and I do, sir, and that she'd arrive faith today. All happened as Garry O'Neil informed us, the Haytians and mutineer blacks of the Saint Pierre's crew being brought up again before the magistrates the week following our arrival home, when, after hearing the additional evidence against them given by Colonel Vereker and the skipper, the 6 black and mahogany-coloured rascals were committed for trial at the next assizes, which we were told would not be held for another month, on the charge of piracy and murder on the high seas. The colonel took advantage of the interval that would necessarily have to elapse before his presence would again be required in court, to escort Miss Elsie to Paris and place her under the care of the sisters at the convent at Neuilly, where I think I told you before, he said her mother had been brought up and educated, while the skipper and others of us belonging to the Star of the North, being compelled to remain within handy reach of the authorities in case our presence at the trial might be required, the opportunity was seized to lay the old barkie up in dry dock and give her a thorough overhaul within and without, though the engines, as proved by our rapid passage here, were none the worse for our breakdown in mid-Atlantic, thanks to the skill and exertions of poor Stoddart and the rest of old Mr. Stokes's staff. Most of us in this way got a short holiday while awaiting the assizes, which I spent with my mother and sister, taking home with me the money I had been awarded as my share of the Saint Pierre's salvage, which had made me fancy myself a temporary Croesus. Alas, though, the sum, large though it was for a young fellow to find unexpectedly in his pocket, went but a very short step in satisfying the rapacious wolf I found at my mother's door when I reached the little cottage where she lived with my sister Janet, in one of the suburbs of Liverpool. A bubble company, whose directors had all been selected for their religious bias rather than their business qualifications, burst at one fell coup, almost in the very hour of my return home, dissipating into thin air, as the Latin poet has it, all the savings of a lifetime which my mother had invested in the swindle. the provision left behind by my father when he died, for her use, and the subsequent benefit of my sister and myself. The devout rogue who had managed the concern to his own worldly interest and that of his fellow religionists, carried on the same, so they say, in a pious and eminently Christian way, no doubt respected alike in the eyes of God and men, according to the loudly voiced tenets of the particular sect to which he and his co-directors mostly belonged, but he managed, all the same, to carry off to a remote and friendly land outside the pale of international law, and where dividends need no longer be paid to clamorous creditors, a considerable amount of portable property of a valuable nature, amongst which probably was our inheritance, my mother's capital. Under these circumstances, it behooved me to consider how I could best aid my poor mother and sister, then left suddenly destitute through no fault of their own. Fortunately, I had the means at hand. In our constant association on board the Star of the North, after his rescue from the drifting boat, in which he greatly exaggerated the help I was able to render him, Colonel Vereker was kind enough to notice me much more than my subordinate position on board would have seemed to warrant, and in a conversation we had together during the voyage home from New York, after asking me what my prospects were, he made me an offer to accompany him back to Venezuela on his return, promising me, should I accept, a good salary to start with, and a fair chance of ultimately making my fortune. Loving the sea and my profession, however, with all a sailor's love, besides being attached to my old ship and her officers, I felt no inclination then to give up what I had learnt to look upon as my legitimate calling, and turn landsman. So, although I had the highest admiration for the colonel, coupled with more than a liking for his young daughter, between whom and myself there seemed such a mysterious sympathy on the evening of my sighting the Saint Pierre, when the captain declared we were some hundreds of miles apart, I reluctantly, and so it seemed to me ungraciously, declined his proposal, telling him I preferred sticking to the skipper and the old barkie. But the colonel very kindly would not take my refusal at first as final, and when setting out for Paris to take Elsie to her convent school, she taking leave of me with many tears and assurances that under any circumstances she would always remain mio amicito, my little friend, pledging herself, too, to be, if allowed at the school, a constant correspondent if I would write to her sometimes to let her know where I was. Well, the kind, good-hearted man, taking, as he said, a deep interest in my welfare for Elsie's sake as well as my own, assured me that he would keep his generous offer open until the period arrived for his ultimate departure for South America, on the termination of the trial of the Haytian pirates and their mutineer accomplices. So, recollecting all this in my hour of need, I naturally turned to the colonel and told him of my trouble, on his return to Liverpool for the assizes, at which, by the way, the black scoundrels and their allies were sentenced to 5 years' penal servitude, the judge regretting his inability to impose a heavier punishment from the fact of proof being wanted of the active participation of the prisoners in the atrociously cruel murder of Cato and the other diabolical work perpetrated on board the ill-fated ship. We were all glad when this matter, with the examination and sickening details that it entailed, was finally settled, and we were at liberty to go where we liked. Colonel Vereker more than justified my confidence in him.
"Heavens, my boy, you must and shall be as my son," he said,
wringing my hand in a grip that I knew would be faithful unto death.
"Come with me, and I will make a man of you, and a rich one too, Dick Haldane."
"But how shall I manage about my mother and sister, sir?" said I hesitatingly. "How shall I manage about them during my absence?"
"You can make over your salary to them, for you will not want anything while at Caracas, as you will live with me as my private secretary," he replied, with another hearty shake of my hand. "The money shall be paid to your mother regularly by my agent here, so that you need have no fears on that score as to her support. But I do not want you to decide such an important change in your life without proper consideration,
and the advice of your friends, my boy. Go and consult Senor Applegarth, who I know is an old friend of yours as well as being your captain, and then if he and your other friends advise your acceptance of my offer, and your mother and sister are willing to part with you, why then, Dick, you may consider the matter settled, and you some day will be very thankful you accepted my offer." The skipper did not hesitate for one moment in giving his opinion, though, like most of my messmates, he was good enough to say how sorry he would be to part with me, and how he would miss me. "Go, by all means, my lad," said he. "But, George, it's a chance that doesn't come twice in a fellow's lifetime, and you may consider your fortune as good as made." Mr. Fawcett and Garry O'Neil were equally enthusiastic. "Faith, no, sir," observed the latter with a comical air of assured deference at my future dignified position, as he imagined it would be. "I hope you'll remember your humble old friend Garry when you're President of the Venezuelan Republic, with a lot of yaller divvies for lackeys and so many dollars that you won't know what to do with them. Begorra, it's wishing I am. I stood in your shoes, Eleanor, and I wouldn't care for to call the Pope me uncle. God bless him." Spokeshave, though, sneered at my success in gaining so good a friend as the colonel. But owing to the accident to the top of his nose, which still being bandaged, or rather court plastered up, and not tending to add to his beauty, he was not able to turn it up and sniff in his former irritating way that always exasperated me so much. As for old Masters, his face became the picture of woe when I informed him I was leaving the ship and the company's service. "You mark my words, Master Haldane," said he in his most sepulchral manner. "Many a one afore you has throwed up the sea, and what good has it done 'em? No good. Them that goes to sea ought to stick to the sea, that's what I says. And if they throws it up, though I hopes you won't, they always live to repent it. I'd be truly sorry you be going. And, Master Haldane, I said as how summat'd come of our seeing that there blessed ghost ship." "And so something has happened, bo'sun, and a precious lot, too, my hearty," said I, jokingly, as I stood on the gangway preparatory to going over the side. "But never mind that now, old shipmate. Good-bye to you, men, and thank you all for your kindness to me from the time I first sailed with you as a youngster." I really believe I could see a tear in the old boatswain's eye as he wished me farewell with the rest of them, the crew manning the rigging to give me a hearty cheer and send-off that could be heard across the Mersey. Thus it was that I took leave of the old barquey, and my mother's consent having been obtained before I finally settled with the colonel, no further arrangements had to be perfected beyond obtaining and preparing my kit, and a hasty run to the cottage to pay a last visit to my old mother and sister Janet, and wish them farewell for a few years, when I looked forward to returning to England and finding them both well and happy, and in more comfortable and prosperous circumstances. That same afternoon, Colonel Vereker and I started off by train from Liverpool for Southampton, at which latter port we embarked in the outward bound West India mail steamer, sailing for Cologne, en route to Venezuela. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Ghost Ship. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Ghost Ship by John Conrad Hutcheson. Chapter 28. During 7 years. We reached La Guayra and from thence Caracas safely enough in spite of the country just then passing through the acute stage of one of its periodical revolutions that had supervened on the top of an earthquake, which convulsions of nature and society are characteristic features of Venezuela, like as the chief product of its fertile soil are cocoa and patriots, the latter being almost as great an article of export as the former, especially after a political crisis, and consisting of all sorts and conditions of men, whether born subjects or alien intriguers, are all desirous of serving their natural or adopted mother country, for a consideration. Colonel Vereker was largely interested in an extensive gold mine in the interior, where he put me as his overseer. This was not an unwise measure for his own sake, apart from any motive he had in advancing my welfare. His real reason for appointing me to the post, for with the exception of the captain of the mine, a Frenchman, the majority of those employed were half-caste Spaniards and Portuguese, all of whom studied their several individual pockets rather than the interest of their employer, while the main body of workers were peons and Mezzites, bastard mulattoes, with a large intermixture of Negro blood, who valued their own lives as little as they did the lives of those with whom they had to deal. I had plenty of work to do here, looking after all these scoundrels, having to keep my eyes open as much as possible in order to prevent wholesale robbery as far as I could, although it was utterly impossible to prevent petty pilfering of the ore on its way from the mine to Puerto Cabello, its general port for transshipment to Europe, to swell the treasure chest of the exiled. However, by adopting the old Latin maxim, suaviter in modo, fortiter in re, treating all without hauteur, which some of the insolent half-caste Spanish Creoles affected, and yet keeping my revolver ready with my powder dry, so as to be prepared for any emergency, I managed to get along very well with the mixed lot I was set over, winning golden opinions from everyone but a few of the worst characters. It sounds as if I were boasting, but this is something for a young Englishman to be able to say in a country which, though it is the veritable El Dorado of poor Drake's dreams, and has possibly a future of wealth and prosperity before it, when it comes under the rule of the Anglo-Saxon race, whether of ourselves or of our cousins in Yankee land, it does not much matter, for we are all of the same race and enterprising spirit. Can it be better described in respect of its present condition by a shorter and far more expressive word? Amongst my other duties, I had charge of all the colonel's voluminous correspondence, he having a mortal hatred to all letter writing in any shape or form, and in addition to my good patron's business communications, was entrusted with the task of dispatching a lengthy epistle every other mail (they went fortnightly from La Guayra to France), informing Miss Elsie of our doings, the colonel himself adding the briefest of postscripts to his pequeña niña, as he invariably termed her, and always enclosing some remembrance for his little daughter, to show that his love exceeded any epistolary proof of the same, as well as a more substantial token of a handsome cheque for her maintenance and education, forwarded to the care of the Mother Superior of the convent. Of all my manifold duties, this was the pleasantest I had to perform, being as grateful as water poured on the parched soil of my exile amongst an alien people, antagonistic to me in everything, and with whom I had to shape a steady course and preserve a stiff weather helm, as sailors say, to avoid open rupture and assassination, the Venezuelese sticking at nothing, especially when that nothing happens to be one whom, for some sufficient reason to their minds, they deemed an enemy, and they chanced to be behind his back, and as I told you before, I steered clear of many enemies, but I could never learn to trust them as a people. Yes, my happiest hours at San Felipe were spent in writing to little Elsie, who answered my own letters as well as those I dispatched on behalf of the colonel with unvarying punctuality, holding to the promise she spontaneously gave in England when we parted on her going to school, at which time she had no idea of my ever accompanying her father to South America. Similarly, the saddest task that could have been laid on my shoulders fell to my lot 5 years later, when the mysterious attraction by which I had been drawn toward her as a boy had grown into the most absorbing affection, a love that filled my heart, and I had to write and tell her, I who would cheerfully have laid down my life to save her a pang, to tell her of her dear father's death. This occurred just as poor Colonel Vereker had arranged for my returning with him to the capital of the state, where another revolution, the sixth, I believe, since I had been in the country, had broken out, with the object, as the object of all these explosions of the mob invariably was, to depose the reigning party in power and put the leaders of the popular movement, for the time being, in the power of the deposed authorities. The colonel, who had a good deal staked on the issue of the struggle, took up arms on the side of the cause he esteemed just, that to which the most respectable of the inhabitants to a man adhered, as he had taken up arms before for the party of law and order, amongst whom he was looked up to not only as a skilled soldier and tactician, but a stalwart partisan, his very name being a tower of strength. Alas, though, no opportunity was afforded him now to display his valour on the battlefield and lead his hosts to victory. For while we were en route to Caracas, a dastardly hound of a Creole, whose blood was a mixture of the beast elements, part Spaniard, part Portuguese, part Negro. Well, this treacherous brute assassinated Colonel Vereker in the most cowardly fashion. I was by, and saw it all. The vile murderer came up to my poor friend as we were resting in a posada on the road from San Felipe, and while engaging him in an apparently friendly conversation respecting the political points of the rising, he suddenly stabbed the dear old man in the back with a long stiletto which he had hidden up his wide shirt sleeves. Fortunately, I was there, and I had time to send a bullet through his brain from my revolver before the wretch could stir a yard from the spot. But this could not save my noble-hearted, kind, generous protector, a man who had been more than a father to me, and for whom I had the utmost affection and respect. No, the death of the scoundrel could not save him, for the wound the cowardly scoundrel had inflicted was mortal. My dear friend and companion only survived long enough to confide his daughter to my care, and give me his blessing ere he died, drawing his last breath in my arms, a smile on his face, and dauntless to the end, as he pressed my hand and uttered the usual parting phrase he had learned from his Spanish associations, "Hasta la mañana," goodbye till tomorrow. It was a long tomorrow, indeed. After seeing the last tribute of respect paid to the colonel's remains, the gallant fellow being buried close to the posada where he had met with his untimely end, and a cross, which I carved myself, placed above his lonely grave, sheltered by a noble palm that stood erect, as he had done when living, a monument of nature's handiwork, I resumed my journey to Caracas in order to carry out my lost friend's last directions. The alcalde, who acted as the colonel's agent and was largely in his confidence, being an acquaintance of many years' standing, produced a copy of Colonel Vereker's will for my inspection, assuring me that this had been drawn up during his last visit to the state capital, while all his affairs were in the most perfect order. The poor gentleman, as the alcalde expressed it, being under the opinion that he would not have long to live, a presentiment of death I have often found many people to have had. Generous and thoughtful for others to the end, he had not forgotten me in this his last testament, showing that the regard he had already displayed for my welfare was no mere temporary fancy. On the contrary, much to my astonishment, he had bequeathed to me quite half his fortune, all his share, indeed, in the Gondifera mine, while all his realized property, which was invested in good English and American securities, out of the reach of the grasping hand of the hungerful Venezuelan patriots, all this he left to his daughter Elsie, from a codicil, too, appended to the document, more in the form of a sacred charge than a legal instrument. Reading between the lines, I could perceive that the large-hearted man had fathomed the secret desire of my heart, though secret it evidently was not to him. Loving Elsie as he did, albeit in a different fashion, For after enjoining upon me to regard his little daughter's interest even as he had studied mine, he added that, should fate bring us together in the future, as had happened so strangely in the past, his dearest wish would be gratified, for he had already learnt to care for me and look upon me as his son. Of course, nothing of this was mentioned when writing to tell Elsie of the awful event and dreadful calamity that had befallen her, although later on, before I was able to return to England, when her education was completed and the good nuns wrote to me, as her father's executor, to say the time had arrived for taking her away from the convent, unless she wished to change her religion and join the sisterhood, to both of which courses I was of course bitterly opposed, and, as you may imagine, was delighted when Elsie herself requested to be allowed to leave. I must, however, have accidentally have shown my feelings toward her and have let the cat out of the bag in the letter I sent home to my mother, in answer to the last communication from Neuilly, asking her to take charge of my darling Elsie until I came home to win and claim her. I imagined this from something that leaked out afterwards, and from the somewhat altered tone of Elsie's letters to me from the date of her leaving France to live with my mother. For, though affectionate enough, they had a certain little air of constraint about them, and though she spoke of various objects of interest to both of us, and of different persons whom she and I knew, and places she went to, she never by any chance ever mentioned herself, never after the letters she sent me containing the passionate outpouring of her inmost heart on receiving the news of her father's death, albeit all this she would feel perfectly certain was to me a sacred confidence. Slight as the change was in her subsequent correspondence, I noticed it, and it worried me, and determined me to have the matter cleared up as soon as I possibly could. Meanwhile, however, I had to fulfil the colonel's last trust, and as I knew what his intentions had been in regard to the crisis in Venezuelan affairs at the time when an assassin's hand prevented him from acting the part he intended to play in the existing revolution, I thought I should be only carrying out his wishes by putting myself in his place as far as it lay in my power to do so. So, after coming to Caracas and settling the details of the colonel's last depositions, making my own will in my turn in case of accidents, though in what way is best known to myself, I went to the headquarters of the government troops and joined the army of General Gomez. Under this able leader I fought in several engagements that were fierce and sanguinary, as all such fratricidal contests are and ever have been in the annals of civil war, at San Sebastian, Carapana, Tarasca, and elsewhere, our guerrilla struggle extending over the whole extensive country in almost every direction, where there was a town to sack or property to plunder, until at last the insurgent patriots were conquered and peace restored. All of this took a long time, and then, having had enough and to spare of fighting and bloodshed, and tired of mining too, I disposed of my interest in the Gondafera mine, and at last sailed for Europe, bidding a long adieu to Venezuela and everything belonging to it, my journey home being hastened by a somewhat tenderer letter than usual from Elsie, who had read a paragraph in the papers about my having been wounded at the Battle of San Sebastian, though of course I had not mentioned anything about the affair to her or my mother, as it was a mere flea bite and of no consequence, and I feared to have alarmed them needlessly had I said anything about it in my letters to them at home. End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of The Ghost Ship. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cheri Gardner. The Ghost Ship by John C. HUTCHESON. Chapter 29. Home at Last. Fellows who knock about the world sailoring and so on cannot help coming to the conclusion that its compass is narrower than stay-at-home folk might be inclined to believe, for you can hardly stir a step without knocking across someone whom you previously imagined to have been miles and miles away, separated, perhaps, by an ocean from yourself. I had scarcely stepped into the train from Southampton, bound Londonwards en route for Liverpool, having only landed from the mail steamer that brought me direct all the way from Cologne that very morning, when whom should I see looking at me from the opposite corner of the railway carriage but a big, bushy-haired, brown-bearded man whom I did not know from Adam. "Fate!" exclaimed this gentleman after a moment's scrutiny, a broad grin lighting up his face and his eyes twinkling with a comical expression that would alone have made me recognize him, had I not heard his delightful, to me at any rate, Irish brogue. "You're either Dick Haldane or the devil," stretching out both hands to grasp mine. I was as pleased to see him as may readily be believed as the genial Irishman was to see me, I was sure, even without his telling me so. "Well," said I, after we had pretty nigh wrung each other's hands off in friendly greeting, "and how are you all getting on aboard the dear old barkie? I want to hear about everybody." "Begorra, Dick, give me time to recover me breath, me boy, and then I'll tell you everything." And then he continued in a bashful sort of way, unlike his usual offhand manner. "I've left the say for good, and set up for a doctor ashore on me own hook fate." "Why?" I exclaimed in great surprise. "How's that?" "Bedad, you'd better ax your sister." "What? My sister Janet?" "Fate, yes, the very same little darlint over Colleen. Dick, you spalpeen, just let me shake your fist again, lad. I'm the happiest man in the world." "Phew!" I whistled through my teeth. "This is indeed a surprise." Then it all came out, Gary telling a long yarn about his calling at my mother's house to ask about me some few months back, and meeting there Elsie, whom he had no difficulty in identifying, he said, as the little girl of the ghost ship, though she had grown a bit taller and was more good-looking than he remembered her at the time he saw her on board the St. Pierre. But, good-looking as she was, he did not think her to be compared to my sister Janet, with whom he had evidently fallen in love at first sight, and very deeply so, too. On his subsequently declaring his passion, impetuous as usual, after a very short acquaintance, my mother insisted, as a first step, to entertaining his suit that he should leave the sea, as he had another profession by which he was quite capable of supporting a wife as well as himself, if he so pleased. "Fate, and I went and bought a practice at once, having a sneak little sum stowed away in the bank," continued Gary. "The savings of me pay for the last 5 year and more, besides that money we all got for salvaging the French ship Shoal, of which I never spent a ha'porth. But, having then, Dick, old chap, your dear old mother wa'n't satisfied. Bless her old heart. She said that your sister and meself would have to wait to get married till you came home. Yes, spalpeen, and not then even, if so be as how you turn nasty and disagreeable and refuse your consent. Fate, ya won't now, will ya? Or bedad, I'll be after breaking every bone in your body, I reckon then have to plaster you up again." To avoid such a terrible contingency, I there and then gave my hearty consent to the arrangement he and Janet, with my mother's concurrence, had thus planned without my knowledge, although, really, if I had been inclined to grumble at not being informed previously of what now so unexpectedly transpired, I had only time and distance to blame, not the parties concerned, for the engagement was of so recent a date that the news of it, though on the way through the post, had not reached Venezuela when I left. After I had answered a lot of Gary O'Neill's questions concerning myself and the time I had passed in South America, speaking, too, of poor Colonel Vereker, whose death he had learnt from my mother, I began again, asking in my turn all about my old shipmates, and of course his own also. "Faith, the skipper is fine and flourishin'," he informed me, "and the old barkie as good and as sound as ever she was. Do you recollect old Stokes?" "Of course I do," I said. "Is he still chief?" "No, no. He retired a year ago or more on a pension, which the company gave him for his long service. A little grummet, you remember him? Well, he's promoted shore to old Stokes' billet. The old chap, though, is alive and hearty and as asthmaticy as ever." "What's become of Mr. Fawcett?" "Och, be jabbers, he's a big man now. He's a skipper on his own hook, just like Cap'n Applegarth. He's got the old Fairly Queen, the second best boat but one to the line. D'ye recollect that old thief of a boatswain we had on the Star of the North?" "Why, you must mean poor old Masters." "I should think I did." "That same, Alana. He wasn't a bad sort of chap, and a good seaman, every inch of him, though I used for to call him an old thief, just for fun and fancy, as the old song says. Well, he's left the old barkie and gone with Cap'n Fawcett in the Fairy Queen. But you haven't axed me once after your old friend Spokeshave. Sure now, you haven't forgot little Conky, faith?" "No, indeed," said I, amused at his query and the funny wink that accompanied it. "What has become of that spiteful little beggar?" "Beggarra, you'll laugh and be amused, but he's married to a wife as big as one of them granny dears we once took in the old barkie to Bermuda. Do you remember? Faith, she's 6 feet high and broad in the beam in proportion. They make a purty couple, bedad, and they do say she keeps him in order. Do you recollect what an argufying chap Spokeshave was aboard?" "I should think I did indeed," replied I. "I think he was the most cantankerous little beast I ever came across in my life, either afloat or ashore." "Faith, you wouldn't say that same now, Dick," rejoined Garry with much earnestness. "The poor little beggar's as make as a cat, for he daren't call his soul his own." I asked after some of the other men belonging to my old ship, including Accra Prout, whom the colonel wished to accompany us to Venezuela, the mulatto refusing on the plea that, though he should always love his old massa, he could not go with him for one insurmountable reason. "Guess I'd have associate with them 10 black rascals than dar, massa. Dis child no like dat no how. I's a nebber sparage my family by associating with niggers, massa, nebber. The Prouts, long good old plantation stock, and raised in Louisiana." This supercilious autocrat, it must be borne in mind, all the time being more than half a negro himself, though, for that matter, his heart was better and his disposition braver than many a white man who would have despised his colored skin. Some of the other hands about whom I inquired had left the old barkie and shipped aboard other vessels, so Garry told me, but at this I was not much surprised, sailors, as a rule, being fond of change and very unconservative in their habits. With such like conversation, my old messmate and I beguiled our long railway journey to Liverpool, which we reached the same evening, but before we had quite exhausted our respective questions and answers respecting everybody we had ever met or known during the time he and I had been to sea together. My meeting with my dear mother and sister after so long an absence abroad can be well imagined, and so too my first interview with Elsie, whom I should hardly have known again, for how can I describe her beauty and grace? And though I had been prepared in some measure from accounts my mother had sent me, still they exceeded my expectations. It would be impossible if I tried to picture her for a month of Sundays, as Captain Applegarth used to say on board the old barkie when he thought a fellow spent too much time over a job. So, to make a long story short, and to avoid all further explanation, it need only be added that one fine day last summer, when the trees were all green and leafy, and the flowers abloom, and happy birds filling the air with song, Elsie and I were married. Garry O'Neil joined his lot with that of my sister at the same time, the two brides being given away respectively by the skipper, who managed to run the Star of the North home in time for the wedding, and old Mr. Stokes, the chief engineer of the old barquey, who had only to cross the road instead of the Atlantic to get to our house, as he lived near to us now. He also was present. Captain Applegarth, who was a very old friend of my mother's, and a kind one too, likewise lived in a good substantial house surrounded by a lovely garden in our pretty picturesque old village. To all whom it may concern, it may in conclusion be mentioned that this double-barreled affair took place in the quaint, old-fashioned, non-ritualistic, semi-Gothic, and many-galleried old village church, of which so few remain now in England, situated close to our cottage, and where our widowed mother had, in our childhood, taught us to lisp our first prayers to heaven, our dead father resting in the ivy-grown and flower-adorned graveyard adjoining. The nuptial knot was tied by Parson Goldwire, as everybody called him in the neighborhood, assisted by Matthew Jacon, the equally elderly parish clerk, without whose joint ministration on the occasion neither Janet nor myself would have believed the marriage ceremony had been properly solemnized, both my sister and myself standing in much awe of the learned divine and his inseparable double, and holding to the creed that the austere pair represented the very quintessence of orthodoxy. End of chapter 29. Recording by Cheri Gardner.
Chapter 30 of The Ghost Ship. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marc Pizzuti. The Ghost Ship by John C. Hutcheson. Chapter 30. A Presentment of the Past. After Elsie and I got spliced, to use the old familiar language of my boyhood, the expressive argot of the sea, for which I shall always retain a passionate love, only second to that I bear towards my dear wife, we set off for the continent, having determined to spend the happy period of our honeymoon abroad. Like the fine folk of the fashionable world with whom, though there is little in common between us, their ways otherwise not being our ways, nor their thoughts, ambitions, hopes, or desires in any respect akin to ours. First, we went up the Seine to Rouen, where I had passed a couple of years of my school life, studying French and teaching the young science of the Gaelic race, with whom I was associated for the time the exigencies of football, as we played the game in Lancashire, varied by an occasional illustrative exhibition explanatory of the merits of la boxe anglaise. Time passed swiftly, with so sweet and sympathetic a companion. Our tastes were similar, both taking the greatest delight in ancient buildings and lovely scenery. The weather, too, was charming, and altogether we were as happy as two mortals can be on this earth. Elsie and I saw all that was to be seen in the old city we first visited, which, in addition to its architectural beauties, should have a special charm for all Englishmen from the fact of the dauntless Richard Coeur de Lion having such an affection for the town that he bequeathed in his lion heart, and then we journeyed on through La Belle Normandie, loitering here and there at those historic spots woven into the life of our country, spots where artists of all nations love to linger. We stayed anon at Slough-Sedaycan, as still as the stone for which it is celebrated, and that furnished the building material of Winchester Cathedral. Bayeux, boastful of its antique tapestry, Andol and Saint-Servan, and away beyond Saint-Michel, so like and yet unlike the light-named Saint-Michel's Mount of Cornwall, in our own sea-girt isle, that it might have been chipped out of the same block by its grand handicraftsman to serve as a replica, until entering brighter Bretagne, in the sunny south of France, where the landmarks of the past seemed to stand out in bolder relief. We visited Nantes and other places of interest, and jogging on thence through Angoulême and Poitiers, halting a day at Poitiers to fight our Plantagenet battles over again, we finally ended our pilgrimage at Bordeaux. At this wonderfully picturesque port, whose semi-ancient, quaintly modern aspect strangely attracted us both, we anchored a while, remaining many weeks in excess of the customary limit of the traditional honeymoon, ours being an indefinite one, and only to be completed, we trust, when Elsie and I ceased to breathe. Late in the autumn, when the leaves had begun to turn russet and brown, and the air of the morning assumed a crisper and more bracing tone, telling us plainly, as these signs tell, that summer had fled for good and aye, and winter was coming by and by, we bade adieu to dear old Bordeaux, and taking a steamer there bound for the Thames, having had enough of railways and land travel, we started to voyage home by sea, my native element. On the evening of the second day that had elapsed since losing sight of Point de Graves at the mouth of the Garonne, towards sunset, we had weathered a shunt, and were shaping a course up channel, northeast, so as to clear the dangerous Casquets rocks of Guernsey, when I noticed a large ship, close hauled on the starboard tack, steaming inwards for the French coast, as if heading for Brest, her nearest port. At that moment the tired sun, which previously appeared to linger above the horizon, uncertain whether to go or to stay, dipped suddenly as we were looking at him, a pale yellow radiance succeeding the dazzling beams that had well nigh blinded us, shining straight in our eyes, while the afterglow, mounting rapidly into the western sky, became more and more vivid each moment. Two purple islands of cloud which floated across the refulgent background, having the lower edges dyed of a rich crimson that seemed to set the sea on fire, and tipped the spars and sails of the passing ship with flame. She was flying the French tricolour, and as our steamer went by, saluting her with a couple of blasts from her steam whistle in friendly greeting, the stranger vessel, as a return, in accordance with the time-honoured rule of nautical etiquette always observed on such occasions, dipped her ensign. This action, coupled with the similarity of the scene and its surroundings, the ship in the distance with her flag half on the hoist, the sunset glow, and the fact of my being on board a steamer, then as now, brought back to my mind at once the incidents of that memorable evening of the past, more than 7 years ago now, the vraisemblance between the two being simply astounding. "Elsie, dearest Elsie," I cried with a start, as the strange coincidence of the presentment struck me, the date being even identical. "Do you remember what day of the month this is, querida mia?" "Why, of course, Dick, I do," she answered, nestling up to my side, as if for protection, for we were sitting in a warm corner by the taffrail, just above the wheelhouse, screened from the observation of the rest of the passengers, who were walking up and down the deck as usual after dinner. "Why, Dick, dear, it's the 7th of November, your birthday, you know. Surely you have not already forgotten the little present I gave you this morning. My likeness in a locket for your watch chain, a miniature done by that clever artist at Orleans. And you told me you would always wear it for my sake. Dick, my husband, where is your memory?" "No, my little one, I have not forgotten," said I, kissing her, thinking she was going to cry at what she thought was forgetfulness on my part. Here it is, next to my heart, like yourself, said I, laughingly. But Elsie, Alma mia, I was thinking of another anniversary, and a Friday evening too, to make it all the more wonderful. Don't you recollect now? Oh, Dick, my dear husband, she whispered, seizing my arm and gazing out over the taffrail at the ship, all ablaze now from the reflection of the sky, and nearly hull down to leeward. I see, I see. What a strange coincidence. It is really wonderful. It is, my darling, said I. But it was more extraordinary still that you should have seen me that memorable evening, now more than 7 years ago, and when I too saw the St. Pierre with you on her deck, and more wonderful still when the captain and some of the crew even to this day insist we were actually 700 of miles apart. Ah, but you're near me now, though, thank God, she cried, looking up into my face with the most charming expression of delight, causing me to be foolish in bestowing another little kiss on her upturned face. I don't know how it was, but whether the ships were as far apart as the captain and the others say, or whether they were not, I did see your ship and you on her, as I told my dear, dear father at the time, and he himself did not believe it. Dick, dear, it must have been the gift of a second sight, as the Scotch people call it. There was a nun at the convent who had it, and could tell, so she said, when anything was about to happen to any of her family, though she couldn't predict events concerning persons who were not blood relations, as she termed them. Don't be frightened, Dick, but I do think I must really possess the same faculty. Well, if that's the case, sweetheart, said I, there must be some psychological affinity between us, and we are both endowed with the same weird gift, although the possession of the same has never been brought to the knowledge of us, except on that one memorable occasion, that cannot be otherwise explained. But the fact of the two ships meeting afterwards may very readily be accounted for under the circumstances. The winds and the currents of the ocean drifted them together, like as they did us, dear. Do you think so? She did not answer for a moment, and, as our steamer sped on her way, the glow in the sky gradually faded and darkness crept over the face of the sea. The flashing light of Ushant, whirling its luminous arms around in rapid rotation, like some spectral windmill away in the distance over our lee, where the French ship had long since disappeared. Presently, my Elsie, who had been looking down into the now gloomy depths alongside, musing over the bitter-sweet memories of the past, lifted her eyes to mine, glazing heavenwards. Now, Dick, my dearest, says she, speaking at last, a certain hesitation and catch in her throat, and a tear in the broken intonation of her voice. Dick, I've been thinking, and it was a power greater than that of the winds and seas that brought us together. It was God. End of chapter 30. Recorded by Marc Pizzuti, Rome, Italy. www.englishmarc.com. End of The Ghost Ship by John C. Hutcheson.